The chains around Sergeant Mike Carter's wrists clanked as he shuffled forward, the weight of his shackles a harsh reminder that he was no longer a soldier, no longer a ranger, no longer a man the country admired. Now, he was a dead man walking. The courtroom was packed. Reporters sat along the back wall, their pens scribbling furiously, cameras flashing. Spectators filled the benches, some whispering, some staring. A few held their breath, waiting to see the moment the once great Army Ranger's fate was sealed. Mike didn't acknowledge any of them. His eyes remained forward, fixed on the judge who sat behind the towering mahogany desk, her lips pressed into a firm line. She already had her mind made up. They all did. The jury foreman stood, hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper in his hands. In the case of the United States versus Sergeant Michael Carter, on the charge of first-degree murder. A pause, a heavy, suffocating pause. Mike already knew what was coming. Guilty. The courtroom exploded. A mixture of gasps, murmurs, and whispers filled the air like a rising storm. Mike barely blinked. The judge lifted her gavel, and the wood cracked against the desk like a gunshot. This court hereby sentences Sergeant Michael Carter to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There it was, the final nail in the coffin. A former Army Ranger, war hero, survivor of 5 deployments, the man who had saved lives on and off the battlefield, now condemned to a rotting prison cell. They said he killed his commanding officer, Major David Locke, that he snapped after an argument, pulled the trigger in cold blood, and left Locke dead on the floor of a military base in Texas. The evidence? The murder weapon was his, a standard-issue sidearm. His fingerprints were found on the gun. A witness, a fellow soldier, testified that he had seen Mike arguing with Locke hours before the murder. It was a tight case, too tight. Mike had no memory of the night. 1 second he had been in his barracks. The next, MPs had kicked down his door, guns drawn, dragging him away like an animal. He had screamed his innocence, but it hadn't mattered. The system wanted a conviction, and they got one. Now, they were done with him, except for one last request. Sergeant Carter, the judge said, folding her hands. Before you are transferred to a federal maximum security prison, you are permitted one final request. Do you wish to exercise this right? Mike lifted his head slowly. The courtroom stilled. The reporters leaned in. The audience waited. Mike's voice was hoarse, raw from years of silence. "Let me see my K9 partner," he said. "One last time." A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor scoffed. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. Military K9 do not maintain bonds with former handlers." "He was more than just a dog," Mike interrupted, his voice sharp, cold. "Axel saved my life more times than I can count. I owe him a goodbye." The judge hesitated. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. Request granted. The next day, Mike was led back into the same courtroom, this time without shackles. His lawyer had pulled some strings, said it wouldn't look good if he was chained up like a monster in front of a military service dog. Not that it mattered. The world already saw him as a monster. The doors opened, and then there he was, Axel. The massive Belgian Malinois strode into the courtroom, his coat gleaming, his posture rigid, disciplined. He had been assigned a new handler, a young lieutenant who barely looked old enough to have earned his rank. Mike felt his chest tighten. Axel looked bigger than he remembered, more muscle, a few new scars across his hind leg, ones he didn't have before. Time had passed. Had Axel moved on? Did he even remember? The judge observed carefully. "You have 10 minutes, she said. Axel stood still, his sharp amber eyes locking onto Mike. For a moment, there was nothing. No reaction, no tail wag, no movement, just stillness. Mike clenched his jaw, his heart sinking. He had spent 5 years rotting in a cell, holding on to the idea that Axel was out there, waiting for him. But now, maybe he really had moved on. Maybe Mike Carter was just a ghost. Then, Axel's ears twitched, and suddenly, he lunged. The young handler yelped, barely holding on to the leash as Axel jerked forward, muscles rippling. The courtroom gasped. Axel's paws scrambled against the floor, his claws clicking as he fought against the restraint. The young lieutenant tried to pull him back. "Axel, heel!" Axel didn't listen. He had one focus: Mike. The handler hesitated, then released the leash. Axel charged. 90 pounds of pure muscle and fury slammed into Mike, knocking him backward. But he wasn't attacking. He was whimpering, crying, pressing his face against Mike's chest, his tail wagging so violently it shook the table behind them. Mike squeezed his eyes shut, his hands gripping the dog's fur. "Yeah, buddy," he murmured, voice thick with something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "You remember?" The courtroom was silent. People had expected a reunion. Sure, a dog might show some recognition of a former handler. But this was different. Military K9s were trained to move on, to adjust to new handlers, to detach from the past. Axel hadn't moved on, and worse, he was acting strange. His tail suddenly stopped wagging, his ears perked, and then he growled. But not at Mike, at someone else in the room. Mike followed Axel's gaze, and froze. Axel was staring at Major Thomas Briggs, the prosecution's key witness. Mike's stomach turned to ice, because if Axel was reacting like that, then it meant Briggs had been at the crime scene. And if Briggs had been there, that meant he had lied under oath. Axel wasn't just recognizing an enemy, he was remembering the real killer. The low, rumbling growl from Axel sent a shockwave through the courtroom. It wasn't just a warning, it was recognition. Axel wasn't growling at Mike. He was locked onto Major Thomas Briggs, the key witness who had testified against Mike. The man who had sworn, under oath, that he had seen Mike arguing with Major David Locke just hours before his murder. Briggs stiffened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The reaction was instant. People in the courtroom began whispering, shifting uncomfortably. The judge narrowed her eyes, but her expression was unreadable. Axel's snarl deepened, his fur bristled, his muscles coiling. He was ready to attack, and for the first time since Mike had been shoved into this nightmare, he felt it too. The truth was right in front of him. The judge cleared her throat, tapping her gavel twice to restore order. "Lieutenant," she addressed Axel's current handler, "control your dog." The young officer swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I don't understand. He's never acted like this before." Axel didn't move, didn't blink. Mike's lawyer, Rachel Dawes, stood up, adjusting her glasses. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm, unwavering, "this is not normal behavior for a reassigned K9. Military working dogs are trained to obey commands, follow new handlers without hesitation. Axel is reacting this way for a reason." The prosecutor, Major Alan Westwood, a man who had built his career on high-profile military convictions, stood up sharply. "This is nonsense," he snapped. "We're letting a dog's growl dictate legal proceedings now? What's next? A psychic?" A few people chuckled, but the judge didn't look amused. Mike felt his blood boil. "He's not just growling," Mike said, voice controlled but lethal. "He's identifying a threat." The judge turned to Briggs. "Major, do you have an explanation for why the K9 unit is reacting to you?" Briggs' jaw twitched. I don't know," he stammered. I've never even interacted with the dog before." Axel's growl deepened. That was a lie, and Mike was done waiting. He stepped forward, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Then let's prove it." Rachel seized the moment. "Your Honor, I request that the prosecution provide access to Axel's K9 body cam footage from the night of Major Locke's murder." Westwood's expression tightened. "There is no body cam footage," he said flatly. "It was deemed corrupted and erased during the initial investigation." Rachel smirked. Funny, because according to military protocol, all K9 unit footage is backed up on 2 separate encrypted servers. So, where's the backup? Westwood hesitated, and that was it. That was the moment Mike knew. The footage wasn't lost, it had been covered up. The judge folded her hands. "Major Westwood, you have 1 hour to retrieve any and all backup footage from Sergeant Carter's mission logs. If the evidence was erased, I want proof of who deleted it." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Westwood opened his mouth, then shut it. He had no way out. Briggs, sitting across the room, looked pale. Mike watched him, his heart hammering, because the truth was about to come out. 1 hour later, the courtroom sat in eerie silence, waiting as the footage loaded onto a screen. The timestamp read 10:15 p.m., the night of Major Locke's murder, A shaky, grainy body cam feed flickered to life. The screen showed a dimly lit alleyway on base, Axel's perspective moving quickly, his panting audible over the microphone. Then, two figures appeared, Major David Locke and Major Thomas Briggs. The entire courtroom went still. Briggs's face drained of color. Axel let out a low, vicious growl. The screen played audio. Locke, agitated, whispering, "You think I don't know what you've been doing? I have the files, Thomas." Briggs, "You need to calm down, Dave." Locke, "No, no more. I'm reporting everything. Your weapons deals, your black market accounts. I already sent copies." A click, a gunshot. Locke collapsed. Axel barked, lunging forward. Briggs whirled around, aiming a silencer-fitted pistol at him. Briggs fired. The footage glitched, then cut to static. Briggs stood up so fast his chair toppled over. That's fabricated!" he shouted, his voice cracking. Rachel turned slowly, a shark's grin forming on her face. "Well, Major Briggs, that's quite the accusation, considering this footage came directly from a classified military server." Briggs bolted, or at least he tried. Axel moved first. The dog lunged, tackling Briggs to the ground in a single brutal motion, his teeth bared inches from the man's throat. Briggs screamed. Members of Parliament swarmed in, restraining him. Westwood, the prosecutor who had buried the footage, looked like he wanted to disappear. Mike? He just stood there, heart racing, hands shaking, because for the first time in 5 years, he could finally breathe. 30 minutes later, the judge sat back, massaging her temples. "This court finds that Sergeant Michael Carter was wrongfully convicted based on false testimony and manipulated evidence." The words didn't feel real, she continued. "This conviction is hereby overturned, effective immediately." The gavel slammed down, and just like that, it was over. MPs dragged Briggs and Westwood away, their protests drowned out by the chaos. Mike turned to Axel. The war dog sat at attention, staring up at him. Mike knelt, running a hand through the fur of the dog who had saved his life. "You did it, buddy," Mike whispered. "You never forgot." Axel pressed his head against Mike's chest. The dog had waited for 5 years, and now? Mike wasn't leaving without him. The gavel had slammed down. Sergeant Michael Carter was a free man, but as he stepped out of the courtroom, the weight on his chest hadn't lifted, not yet. Because Axel? The dog who had saved his life, the dog who had proven his innocence in front of the world, wasn't free. The military still considered him an asset, a tool, a weapon. And they weren't going to let Mike walk away with him without a fight. Mike stood just outside the courthouse, the air thick with reporters shouting questions. "Sergeant Carter, what will you do now? How does it feel to be free after 5 years? Do you plan to sue the military?" Mike ignored all of them, because in the distance, he saw them coming. 2 MP Humvees pulled up to the curb. A high-ranking officer stepped out, Colonel Adam Sterling, the man in charge of K9 operations. And behind him, a team of handlers. Mike's fists clenched. They were here for Axel. Axel sensed it too. The dog sat tense at Mike's side, ears up, body still, waiting for a command. Sterling sighed, approaching Mike with military stiffness. "Carter," he said, voice clipped. "It's over. You got your freedom, but the dog stays with us." Mike's jaw tightened. "Like hell he does." Sterling shook his head. "Axel is still an active-duty military asset. You know the regulations. He doesn't belong to you." Mike stepped forward. "That dog," he growled, "just did more to uphold justice than anyone in that damn courtroom." Sterling's face remained blank. "This is not up for discussion." 2 handlers moved toward Axel. Axel's ears flattened, his body coiled, muscles tensing, ready to fight. And Mike was ready to kill. "You touch him," he warned, "and you'll regret it." The handlers hesitated. Because Mike Carter wasn't just any soldier, he was an Army Ranger, a man who had trained for war his entire life. And Axel? Axel was a war dog. Together, they weren't just going to roll over and let the military take what was theirs. Rachel Dawes, Mike's lawyer, stormed out of the courthouse, heels clicking furiously against the pavement. "Oh, I don't think so," she snapped, shoving between Mike and the handlers. Sterling turned, annoyed. "This is a military matter, Ms. Dawes." "This is a legal matter," she interrupted. And last I checked, military canines can be retired into the custody of their former handlers under special request. Sterling exhaled sharply. We don't grant those requests lightly. Rachel smirked. Oh, you're going to grant this one. Because if you don't, she stepped closer, lowering her voice. Every major news outlet in this country is already running the story about how a military war dog exposed a wrongful conviction. If you try to take him now, I will personally ensure that the entire country knows you're trying to rip this dog away from the man he saved. Sterling hesitated. Mike saw it. The first crack. Rachel leaned in. Unless, of course, you want your name on the next headline? Sterling exhaled. He turned to the handlers. Stand down. Mike barely breathed. Axel stayed at his side, unmoving. Sterling turned back to him. You win this round, Carter, he said through clenched teeth. The dog's yours, but don't think for a second that this means you're free from military oversight. Mike didn't smile. He just reached down, ran his hand through Axel's fur, and finally let out the breath he had been holding. You hear that, buddy? He murmured. You're coming home. Axel let out a sharp, happy bark. For the first time in 5 years, Mike Carter wasn't alone. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Briggs was rotting in a military prison. Westwood had been stripped of his title, but there was still one name left on Mike's list. The man who had ordered the cover-up. The man who had signed the papers that sent him to death row. General Marcus Holloway. Mike stood in his motel room later that night, staring at a printed file on his bed. Holloway had disappeared. Officially, he had taken a leave of absence. Unofficially, he was running. Rachel walked in, tossing her bag on the table. You're not letting this go, are you? Mike shook his head. Not a chance. Rachel sighed. Mike, you're free. Axel is free. Isn't that enough? Mike glanced at Axel, who sat on the floor, watching him with sharp, knowing eyes. Axel hadn't moved on, because he knew this wasn't over. Mike turned back to Rachel. They stole 5 years from me, he said. They almost killed me, and they tried to bury the truth. He picked up the file with Holloway's name on it. They don't get to walk away from that. Rachel exhaled. Then I hope you have a plan. Mike smirked. I always do. The next morning, Mike stood in the desert sun, Axel at his side, staring at a private airstrip. A small jet sat on the runway. The tail number? Registered to General Marcus Holloway. Mike adjusted his Kevlar vest, loaded his sidearm, and looked down at Axel. You ready, boy? Axel wagged his tail once. Mike smirked. Good. Let's go get him. Together, they disappeared into the desert. The hunt had begun. The desert heat rippled against the tarmac of the private airstrip. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the ground. The small jet on the runway sat like a predator waiting to pounce, its engines humming, the faint scent of burning fuel filling the air. Sergeant Michael Carter stood at a distance, watching. His body was still, his mind sharper than it had been in years. Axel sat beside him, ears up, tail still, waiting, ready. This wasn't just a mission, it was a reckoning. The man who had signed off on his execution, who had buried the truth, who had stolen 5 years of his life, General Marcus Holloway, was right here. And Mike wasn't letting him leave. Mike pulled the binoculars from his vest, scanning the airstrip. 3 armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their body language casual but ready. Professionals. Holloway didn't hire amateurs. A black SUV was parked near the jet, engine still running. Holloway was inside, waiting for clearance to take off. Mike smirked. He wasn't going to get it. He looked down at Axel. You ready, boy? Axel's ears twitched. He let out a low, controlled breath, his body coiling. Mike took one last glance at the airstrip. Then he moved. Mike circled around, using the hangars for cover. The guards weren't expecting trouble. Why would they? The world thought Mike Carter was just some exonerated veteran, happy to be free. They didn't know he was hunting. The first guard stood near the entrance, hands resting on his rifle, eyes scanning the sky. Mike moved like a shadow, a swift step, a sharp elbow to the throat. The guard gasped, choked, then dropped. One down. Axel slipped ahead, weaving between crates, his body low and lethal. The second guard turned, too late. Axel lunged, clamping down on the man's wrist with crushing force. A short scream, then silence. 2 down. The third guard reached for his radio. Mike grabbed him from behind. A single controlled strike to the temple. The man crumpled. 3 down. The way was clear. Mike crouched behind the black SUV, listening. Inside, Holloway was on the phone. "This is taking too long," the general muttered. "Get me in the air now." Mike smiled. Not happening. He slid the combat knife from his belt and sliced through the tires, quick and clean. The SUV wasn't going anywhere. Axel let out a low growl, eyes locked on the vehicle. "Yeah," Mike whispered. "I feel it too." He stepped forward and yanked the door open. Marcus Holloway froze mid-sentence, the phone slipping from his ear. His eyes widened as he took in the sight of Mike Carter standing in front of him, alive, free, and armed. "You," Holloway whispered. Mike smirked. "Miss me?" Holloway's hand darted for his sidearm. Axel moved first. The dog lunged into the SUV, teeth sinking into Holloway's forearm, tearing him out of the vehicle with raw, brutal force. The general screamed, collapsing onto the dirt. Axel didn't let go. Mike knelt beside him, watching Holloway struggle. "That's enough, boy!" Axel released, stepping back, his teeth bared. Holloway clutched his bleeding arm, eyes burning with fury. "You think this changes anything?" Holloway hissed. "You can't touch me. I own half the people in Washington." Mike pulled a small device from his pocket, a live streaming body cam, already broadcasting to every news station in the country. Holloway's face drained of color. Mike smiled. "Not anymore, you don't." Holloway's breathing turned ragged as he realized what was happening. "You think this will be enough?" he snapped. "Even if I go down, there are others. You can't stop all of us." Mike exhaled. "You're right," he admitted. Then he grabbed Holloway by the collar, dragging him onto his feet. "But I can start with you." Sirens wailed in the distance. Military MPs flooded the airstrip, surrounding them. Mike raised his hand slowly, turning to the lead officer. "This man," he said, nodding toward Holloway, "is guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder." The officer hesitated. Then, he pulled out his cuffs. Holloway's face contorted in rage. "You son of a—" The cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. "Marcus Holloway," the officer said, "you're under arrest for crimes against the United States military." Mike stepped back, watching as Holloway was dragged away. Axel sat beside him, tail wagging once. Mike reached down, scratching behind his ears. "Nice work, partner." 1 week later, Mike stood on a quiet stretch of land, watching the sun rise over the mountains. A small cabin sat behind him, his new home. No more cells, no more trials, no more running, just peace. Axel sat beside him, staring at the horizon, his tail sweeping across the dirt. Mike chuckled. "You ever gonna stop watching my six?" Axel let out a short bark. Mike smiled. "Yeah, I didn't think so." The world had taken everything from him once. Now, he was finally taking something back. And he wasn't alone. Not anymore. Together, they walked toward the cabin. Free, finally free.